What's going on, everyone? Welcome to the Friday, July 5th edition of the Ship My Money Show. I'm your host, Adam Scherer. You can follow me on Twitter at ShipMyMoney DFS. Hope you all had a good 4th of July. Huge 12-game MLB slate to wrap up the work week. Looks like it should be pretty fun. I enjoy 12 games is a lot. I prefer 8 to 10, but I do enjoy the larger slates just because you get to generally play kind of who you want. You can play lineups that look really good. You don't have to worry about raw ownership quite as much just because it naturally flattens out. So it should be pretty fun to walk through this one. As always, going to look at each game, talking about pitching, hitting, all of that stuff. If you have questions, throw them in chat. Happy to hit on those as I see them, whether it's about the slate specifically or DFS in general. Give the video a like, subscribe to the channel. All that stuff helps out quite a bit. Now, starting with the first game, we have the Red Sox and the Yankees in Yankee Stadium. Good park for hitting, of course. Nestor Cortez on the mound for New York. Tanner Houck going for the Red Sox. So two solid pitchers here. Cortez is getting quite a bit more ownership because he is a lot less expensive than Houck. I think that is warranted. It's not a good matchup for either pitcher. The Yankees, just because they have Judge and Soto, are the more difficult matchup for the more expensive Tanner Houck. For the season, Houck has about a 24% strikeout percentage, 2.97 xFIP. He's been very, very good in terms of run prevention. He's been pretty good at getting strikeouts, but the matchup here is certainly concerning. And it's a 12-game slate, so you have a ton of pitching options that you can get to without prioritizing an expensive guy against the Yankees. On the other side, though, Cortez, also a pretty good strikeout pitcher, 23.2% K percentage, 3.89 xFIP for the season. He is very reasonably priced at 8,500, projected for around 18% ownership, showing up in about 14% of the lineups that I built. So maybe going a little bit overowned, but nothing that is concerning. Since the start of last season, the Red Sox active roster has the fifth highest strikeout percentage against left-handed pitching at 23.9%, 100 WRC plus. So that looks pretty good for Cortez as well. He's done a pretty good job limiting power this year. 166 expected ISO allowed to righties, 132 to lefties. Has a little bit higher strikeout percentage against lefties, as you would expect, but still striking righties out between 22 and 23% of the time. Just looks like a pretty solid mid-range play. Obviously it's a scary enough spot, but the salary, makes up for it. Neither of these offenses are going to look like priorities given their matchups, but they are certainly playable in tournaments just because of the talent level in this park. Goes without saying that Aaron Judge and Juan Soto are always playable, but it's pretty much the same thing for both of these offenses. Neither pitcher is somebody that you're looking at and saying, oh, well, they really struggle with this. They really give up power to right-handed hitters or left-handed hitters. Neither of them give up much power to either side of the plate. They're both good pitchers. If you go to either offense, it's because they're not getting much ownership. They're in Yankee Stadium, and they do have talent. But outside of that, there's not much to say here, I don't think. It's pretty much you're betting on talent if you go there. Low on talent in Yankee Stadium, that's fine. But neither one's going to look like a priority. Next, we have two of the worst offenses in baseball facing each other in a pitcher's park in Miami. Drew Thorpe going for the White Sox. Brian Hogan, I believe, is going for Miami. He is expected to be activated and make the start today. Don't know exactly how deep into the game we are expecting him to go. He's been working as a reliever this year. He threw 2 2/3 innings in his most recent rehab start, but he's 8,100 on DraftKings, so it doesn't really matter. You're not playing him despite the good matchup with the White Sox. The more interesting talking point on Hoeing is that his strikeout prop right now is 2.5 with the over being plus money. That is showing up as a good bet for me in my first run of everything. I haven't bet it, though, because I wanted to dig into it more and didn't have time before the show. But I think that's kind of the more interesting angle with Hoeing. If you think he's going to give you 3 or 4 innings here, I would bet that over. I still obviously wouldn't be playing him at 8,100 in DFS. On the other side, though, Drew Thorpe, 7K price tag, only getting 2% ownership right now, a little bit surprising to me. Showed up as optimal 5% of the time, also a little bit surprising to me, just given the good matchup against Miami in a good park and the fact that he's only 7K. I expected Thorpe to look a little bit better here. Maybe probably just a function of there being so many pitchers on the slate. You end up, and also cheap bats on the slate, you end up just not really needing him. But if you do need a low-end pitcher in this price range, I think he's perfectly fine. Projects for around the 20 to 21% strikeout percentage going forward, 4.2 to 4.5 FIP, pretty much depending on where you look. Has a very, very, very good changeup, so he does have an out pitch. So I do think that it's probably just a function of the slate why he's not showing up better right now. But if you did need somebody in that range at low ownership, I don't have any problem with it. It's obviously a good matchup against the Marlins. Miami's active roster against right-handed pitching this year has an 88 WRC plus. That is only slightly better than the White Sox on the other side of this game at 83. Neither pitcher is great, but both of these offenses suck. Neither pitcher is getting ownership, so you don't get that negative correlation factor. The park's not good for hitting. I have a hard time wanting to get to much in this game. Andrew Benintendi's showing up here around 8% owned. He's cheap, but there's just such limited upside for him given that he doesn't have a lot of power, and you're just going to have so many good hitters on this slate. That's not really the kind of guy that I like using as a one-off. I don't really want to be stacking the White Sox here. Jazz Chisholm at 4,500. It looks fine. Same goes for Jesus Sanchez. Both of these guys have power from the left side. On a shorter slate, I'd probably be a little bit more interested. As is, I think that like 7 to 8% ownership looks fine. But overall, two of the worst offenses in baseball in a pitcher's park on a slate with 24 offenses isn't going to get me too excited. San Francisco taking on Cleveland in what has now become one of the best hitters parks in baseball. So that's a nice park upgrade for the Giants. They do get a tough matchup against Tanner Bybee, though. Bybee getting about 24% ownership, only showed up optimal about 13% of the time for me. So that is a little bit surprising because I do think Bybee's a good pitcher. 28.5% K percentage this year, 3.3 xFIP. The matchup with the Giants is fine. 23.5% K percentage against right-handed pitching this year, 103 WRC plus. It's not a cakewalk, but it's not a horrible matchup by any stretch. So I guess, I think Bybee's going a little bit over-owned, but still looks like a good pitcher as long as you are contrarian somewhere else in your lineup. I don't really have an issue with that $9,200 price tag. Spencer Bivens getting the open at 4K. I don't really see any reason to be getting to him. Left-handed power in this park, as I mentioned, is really playing up this season because they changed something in the stands, essentially, and it opened up a jet stream out to right field. So power in this park has played up more. Jose Ramirez, always a good play at third base. No problems with getting to him. Getting to some of these other relatively expensive Cleveland bats looks pretty good as well. Josh Naylor at 5,400. High upside first base option now that you're getting so many home runs in Progressive Field or whatever it's called now. Tyler Freeman's cheap if he's batting second. Noel gives you cheap power at 2,500. His salary really just needs to come up. He is a legitimate power hitter, legitimate home run threat. He should just be like a 3,500 plus guy, even if he's not an elite major league hitter overall at this point. We know that the power is there. Projected or put up a 283 ISO at AAA this year, 200 last year. Projects for like a 170 plus ISO in most projection models on Fangraphs, and he's just 2,500. So obviously the upside for him is massive. Looks like a pretty good value play. Probably will get some ownership there. So don't mind getting to Cleveland overall as a stack or as one-offs. Ramirez really stands out overall. Noel looks like a very good value. On the other side, San Francisco, if you're going there, I think it's just because of the park upgrade and the negative correlation with Bybee. You are getting a 20+% owned pitcher in a park that's been very, very good for home runs this year. You do have some power on the Giants, and they are pretty cheap, so that's nice. Lamont Wade at 3,400, just a good hitter overall. You have that left-handed bat in this park. That looks really good. I like him individually as a negatively correlated one-off or part of a mini stack or full stack against Bybee. Chapman, Soler, we know these guys have some power. It's a good park overall. They do negatively correlate with Bybee, so I can see getting to them, but I would be more interested if this slate were smaller, just because when you get to a 12-game slate like this, there's a pretty wide range of outcomes where maybe the Giants do well enough to make Tanner Bybee not a good play, but they still don't do well enough to be one of the top scoring stacks on a slate with 23 other offenses. So it's less appealing to me naturally on a 12-gamer than if this were like yesterday's 7-gamer and you had Bybee getting a bunch of ownership. It would be less likely that if the Giants make Bybee a bad play, that they're not one of the top scoring stacks. Whereas today, there's still a pretty wide range where they can get to Bybee and still not be a winning stack. So that makes them a little bit more difficult to get to. But the negative correlation certainly is there. The power upside certainly is there. Great hitters park here in Cincinnati with the Tigers taking on the Reds. Reese Olson for the Tigers, Carson Spears for the Reds. No ownership coming into either of them, really. I do think that Olson's going a bit overlooked here. He's only projected for about 5% ownership right now. I think that probably comes up generally when I do this show in the morning and you see something like a pitcher showing up as optimal 14 or 15% of the time for me and only projected for 5% ownership, usually by lock, this guy is around 10 to 15% owned. And I think that's where he should be. So if this ownership were to hold, he would just look like a really good play to me. But it's a really tough park to pitch in. It is a very good strikeout matchup, though. Cincinnati striking out 26.1% of the time against right-handed pitching this season, 90 WRC plus. Olsen has been solid overall, 21.7% strikeout percentage, 3.6 xFIP. Again, a huge park downgrade, but he's only $7,200. If he's low owned, I really like him. If that ownership does adjust and get closer to where I think it should be, he still looks like a pretty good value play. But yeah, I think just right now, at least projected to go a bit overlooked. That doesn't mean that I'm not interested in Reds bats. I'm interested in any bats really in this park, regardless of matchup. Detroit showing up right now is my second most utilized stack. Cincinnati a bit further down the list because, again, Olsen is a pretty solid pitcher overall, but still a park that is just great for offense. Olsen has held lefties to a 136 expected ISO this year. Righties have a sub 100 expected ISO. So, again, he's not a pitcher that you're expecting guys to do a lot of damage against him. But you do have Candelario very reasonably priced at 4,200. You have Ellie De La Cruz from his better side of the plate, always a very high upside option. But the team that really stands out here is Detroit. They are very, very, very inexpensive, getting a massive park upgrade, especially for home runs in Cincinnati. They're just going to look really good here. Also going up against a pitcher that, isn't anything special. So they kind of check all the boxes there. The only box that they don't check is that they're not getting any negative correlation because nobody's playing the opposing pitcher. But you have value. You have a great park for offense. You have some hitters that actually, are good and can do damage. Carson Spears projects for about a 19% strikeout percentage, around the 4.5 plus FIP going forward. So I'm happy to get to these Tigers bats. And they're projected for moderate ownership, but nothing too crazy. Ursula, multi-position eligible at 2,900. I really like Colt Keith at 3K. This is a highly regarded hitting prospect that started the season out really poorly, and it's held down his salary as a result. But you're getting a great park. He's come around. He's been hitting better lately. It's not a bad matchup, so I really like that. Malloy is cheap. Perez is pretty cheap at 3,600. Riley Green's the only actually expensive guy in this lineup, and he is a stud. There's no reason not to be playing him. So the Tigers look really, really good to me. Very happy to get to them in this spot, in this park. Philadelphia facing the Atlanta Braves in Atlanta. Doesn't look like quite as appealing an offensive game as the last one. For Philadelphia, we have Aaron Nola. For Atlanta, we have Max Fried. Both pitchers getting 10 to 15% ownership, and I think that's warranted. Neither matchup is great, but both offenses are banged up, and that obviously makes them worse than usual. Atlanta's active roster against right-handed pitching this year only has a 94 WRC plus. They rank fifth in strikeout percentage at 24.5%. So clearly not, the same level of Atlanta offense that you're used to. Losing Acuna hurts them a lot. And then also you just have guys having down years so far. They probably will bounce back, but to date, this has not been a very good offense. And then Philadelphia, missing two of their best hitters as well, or three of their best hitters as well, if you include JT Realmuto in that. And Max Fried and Aaron Nola, both just good pitchers. Nola striking out 23.2% of hitters so far this season, 3.39 xFIP for him. Fried striking out 21.8% with a 3.34 xFIP. Not the strikeout numbers that you love from somebody at Fried's salary, but he is an efficient pitcher. He does work deep into games. That does help make up for that. So both of these guys at very fair price tags just look like secondary options where you're not going out of your way probably to jam them into a ton of lineups, but they are just useful pieces here. They're in good enough spots. They are both very good pitchers. Nola is typically better at home, but at 8,800, I'm not too worried about home road splits or anything like that. So both pitchers here look pretty good. Neither offense is going to look great. You can sort of make the same case for either offense that you were or that I was for the Yankees and Red Sox at the beginning, where there are talented hitters here. They're not going to get any ownership. They can just have good games. But outside of that, I don't think there's a lot to be said. It is just a situation where like a good game for this Atlanta offense is a tournament winning game. Whereas a lot of other offenses, even if they score 8 runs, it's on the back of singles and doubles, and it's just not as appealing. But with Atlanta, with Philadelphia, you do get that legitimate home run upside, but very unappealing matchups for both offenses. Another good hitters park here with the Rays taking on the Rangers in Texas. Nice park upgrade for Tampa Bay. Michael Lorenzen on the mound for the Rangers. Don't know why Aaron Savali is projected here because he was just traded the other day. Shane Baz, it looks like, for Tampa Bay. Double checking that now. Yeah, Shane Baz listed as the starter or probable starter for Tampa Bay at 7,300. Not looking that useful here just because there are so many good pitchers on the slate. He was a highly regarded pitching prospect, has upside certainly, but just probably don't really need to get there on this slate. Don't think you really need to be getting to Lorenzen on this slate either. So far this season, Baz 6 games started. Or sorry, that's in the majors. Previously, I don't have his minor league numbers in front of me at the moment. But yeah, he was part of the Glasnow trade. He's a highly regarded prospect in general. Has shown strikeout upside in the past, but I don't think you need to get there today. Offensively, either offense I think looks pretty good. It's a good park for home runs. You have 2 not stud pitchers. Lorenzen certainly gives up some power, particularly to right-handed hitters. Shane Baz, again, hasn't had sustained success at the major league level, at least not yet. 250 expected ISO allowed to right-handed hitters for Lorenzen so far this season. Isaac Paredes at 4,200, Yandy Diaz at 3,900, Randy Arozarena 4,100, all very fairly priced for that matchup. Lorenzen has been better at limiting damage to lefties because of a very effective changeup. That doesn't make me not want to play Brandon Lau or Josh Lowe at cheap price tags. It just is worth noting that he has been reverse splits, and there is a reason. So, Tampa Bay overall, I think, looks like a pretty appealing stack. They're cheap. They're in a good park. They're getting a park upgrade. The matchup is fine. I do like the right-handed power specifically because Lorenzen just doesn't have the same sort of out pitch or secondary pitch that is really effective against righties that he does against lefties. But overall, Tampa Bay looks pretty good. Texas on the other side, not quite as easy to get to, but still pretty reasonably priced here going up against Baz. $5K price tag on Seager, who's dealing with that wrist injury. Only $3,600 for Nathaniel Lowe is a pretty good price tag. Third base, shortstop, MPE on Josh Smith is pretty useful. Just makes it really easy to get him into lineups if you're looking to stack or use Texas as mini stacks. That'll be pretty easy to do. So I don't mind getting there. Adolis Garcia at 4,500 is cheap. Semien pretty cheap at 4,700. You're just seeing the salaries on these Texas bats a little bit lower than their talent level typically warrants because they haven't been good or that good so far this season for the most part. Finally got to Shane Baz's AAA numbers. 10 starts at AAA this year, 39 and a third innings pitched, so not going very deep into games generally. Striking out 24.7% of hitters, but also walking about 13%. Projects for like a 23 to 25% K percentage going forward, around a 4 FIP. Not a bad pitcher, but certainly not a finished product either. He is somebody that these Rangers bats could certainly get to in this park. So not a ton of ownership coming into this one. The highest owned guys here are the value bats from Tampa Bay, as you would expect. But I think it looks like a pretty good game for offense. It's not the best. I still prefer Detroit and Cincinnati, for example. And then we have the Coors game coming up. But it does look like a pretty good park to be looking to get the bats. Now, before we get to the Coors game, where obviously we do have a lot of offense to talk about, as a reminder, if you have not already signed up for Endgame Syndicate, the link is in the description below. That is the site that we just launched. Utical, Brick75, Nerdy Tenor, and myself. Our goal there is to essentially make it so you are more self-sufficient and profitable at DFS instead of just giving you a bunch of data every day and telling you that you're going to win by just clicking a couple of buttons. We're trying to actually teach you how to improve your process, make more money on your own, be less reliant on other sources. Ultimately, if you're able to do that, it saves you money because you can cut back on your subscription fees to other sites. You don't have to rely on paying a bunch of different sites a bunch of money for data. And even if you aren't going to go all the way and build all your own stuff, we are also trying to teach you how to use publicly available stuff more efficiently so that you can make more money that way as well. We already have a bunch of videos up. We have Utical talking about his process. I talk about my process. Utical also dives into some sports-specific stuff with MLB that he likes to look at. Brick has videos up showing you how to build your own ownership projections and your own actual projections. I have stuff up, again, showing my process using SaberSim. Nerdy Tenor has a bunch of toy game videos up already, diving into game theory and why, the most efficient ways to play DFS and why that is. We also are active in the Discord. monthly roundtable discussions as well, where all four of us are live answering your questions. So I recommend checking it out. I'm really excited about it. It's the kind of thing that I wish existed at any time before now. I think, I've already learned a lot from it, and years ago would have really, really learned a lot from it. So I highly recommend checking that out if you haven't already. The link is in the description below. Now moving on to the Kansas City Royals and the Colorado Rockies in Coors Field. Obviously one of the best hitting environments on the slate. Cole Reagans is on the mound for Kansas City. Whoever is on the mound for Colorado projected so poorly that I accidentally cut him off. It is Kyle Freeland. So yeah, that checks out. Freeland has been garbage this season. He missed a giant portion in the middle of the season, but started out really poorly, came back, did have a good start against Washington, went 6 innings. His most recent start, actually, he was good against the White Sox as well. But Kansas City is neither of those teams, and Freeland is just generally not a very good pitcher. So the Royals are going to look good. They are pretty clearly the top stack today by a wide margin. That isn't surprising at all. It is their first game in Coors, so there is always that factor where, maybe they get there in games 2 and 3, but not in game 1. Cole Reagans, though, before we get on to the hitters, I don't care that it's Coors Field. Cole Reagans still looks good. 8,200 is an insane price tag for this guy. He is just way better than that. I don't really care where he's pitching. The Rockies are a below average offense. They have the second highest strikeout percentage against left-handed pitching on their active roster. Yes, this game is in Coors. Yes, it is more difficult to get strikeouts there. Whatever, but Coors thing you're going to throw out there is true. But when you make Cole Reagans $8,200, it doesn't really matter. Like, this is a guy that if you were facing Colorado in Kansas City or in like a neutral park, he would be $10,500 if pricing were efficient. So making him $8,200 is accounting for whatever but Coors Field thing you want to throw out there. So very, very happy to get to Reagans here. And so is the field, projected for 27% ownership. He's showing up as optimal about 20% of the time for me. So as usual, probably going a little bit over-owned, but it's one spot in your lineup. Generally, you're going to be able to make really, really good lineups, even if you're using a quote-unquote over-owned pitcher, because this is still one of the most likely pitchers to succeed. Now moving on to the offenses, Kansas City clearly just looks great. This park is a dream come true for Bobby Witt. Like, Kauffman Stadium is a great park for Bobby Witt because the outfield is so big. It increases, your batting average on balls in play. He can turn singles into doubles into triples, all of that. That all applies to Coors Field as well, except it's also easier to hit home runs here than in Kauffman. So you get a park that is just tailored to what Bobby Witt does, and then say, oh, and by the way, you can also hit home runs easier. Pretty comfortable saying he's the best hitting play on the slate, even at 6,800. He gives you stolen base upside as well. Not the best stolen base matchup against left-handed Freeland to start, but he generally will run when he gets the opportunity. And yeah, he looks great. I don't care that he's 6,800. You do have a very natural pivot if you wanted in Ellie De La Cruz, who is getting like 1/3 the ownership for $400 less and gives you, the same sort of upside. But just from a likelihood of success standpoint, Bobby Witt looks absolutely fantastic. The park is perfect for him, has the righty-lefty matchup. Everything looks really good for Bobby Witt. Hunter Renfroe, cheap at 4,100, looks good. He has power. Freeland doesn't miss a lot of bats either, so that's a big thing here. Freddie Fermin, 3,900 at catcher. Do pay attention, and this goes for Renfroe as well. The biggest, I think, downside, or that's not the right word, biggest risk factor, I guess, for Kansas City here, outside of it's baseball and it's hard to hit, we will want to pay attention to their lineup because there is going to be pinch hit risk here with the lefty Freeland. Like, if you get Fermin in the lineup, you get Renfroe in the lineup, Garrett Hampson in the lineup, Blanco in the lineup, there's going to be left-handed bats on the bench that can pinch hit later on in the game. So we will want to pay attention not only to who is in the lineup, but who specifically is not in the lineup and what position are guys in the lineup playing. Like, if Freddie Fermin is catching and Salvador Perez is DHing, Fermin's actually a little bit safer because for them to move, like if they were to pinch hit for Fermin and move Perez to catcher, you lose your designated hitter. And obviously they don't want to do that. But if Perez is catching and Fermin is DHing, then they can just sub in a left-handed bat for Fermin later in the game. And he has substantial pinch hit risk in that case. So do pay attention to exactly how the lineup is constructed here. But goes without saying, this team is just going to look really, really good. And the nice thing about a 12-game slate is that the ownership's not crazy. Bobby Witt pulling like 16%. I think that probably ends up being higher. we've just seen a trend of like the stud players being under projected as far as ownership goes, not and sites having trouble accounting for Sims or whatever it is that's driving them up. Aaron Judge frequently is projected for like 10% ownership when he's always 20. Bobby Witt, I think, probably comes in closer to this like 25% mark. But for the rest of the team, I think it is likely that you get like 10 to 15% ownership. You'll still need to find ways to be different. Steven Leibowitz said maybe mini stack them with the Tigers. That works too. That's something that I did a lot yesterday on the 4-game course slate. I had Milwaukee was my highest owned overall stack, but I didn't have many 5-mans of them at all. I was just using 2-mans and 3-mans, mostly mixed in with lower owned full stacks. You can do that certainly with Kansas City. Maybe, trying to think of a low owned stack we talked about before that had upside. Like maybe you go to the Giants, right, against Bybee. You get that negative correlation stack. You go to 5 Giants. And then the thinking is if the Giants light up Tanner Bybee, I don't then need some other low probability stack with them. I want Bobby Witt Jr. I want Salvador Perez, whoever from Kansas City. Like that would make a ton of sense. That would be a really well constructed lineup. So that is one way that you can handle this ownership as well. On the other side, I do think that the Rockies are an interesting tournament team just because they're in Coors Field. They're not getting any ownership, and Reagans is getting 30% ownership. I mentioned being somewhat interested in the Giants because of Bybee's ownership. It's the same thing here. If this were a shorter slate, I would be a lot more interested in Colorado, but Reagans is a really good pitcher. This is still just a great park for hitting, though. You're getting no ownership to the Rockies. If they do well, 30% of the field just lost their pitcher. So they are, I think, a powerful stack in the largest field tournaments, like the biggest tournaments you're playing. The Rockies have more interest. I am more interested in the Rockies there than I am if you're playing, small field stuff. I don't think you need to go that far off the board. Houston facing Minnesota. In Minnesota, much less interesting offensive game going from Coors to Target Field. Pablo Lopez is going for Minnesota. Sean Dubin is pitching for the Astros. No interest in Dubin. Lopez, 9% or 9 to 10% ownership, projected 9% chance of being optimal for me. Very, very tough strikeout matchup for him against Houston. Kyle Tucker, missing is a big deal. It does make this lineup weaker, but still their active roster has the 3rd lowest strikeout percentage against right-handed pitching this year. 112 WRC plus. Still has to deal with Yordan Alvarez, Jose Altuve, Alex Bregman. Still a pretty good lineup overall. So yeah, like Lopez from a talent standpoint looks fine. 28.3% strikeout percentage is very good. 3.17 xFIP. His strikeout percentage and walk percentage, both very, very similar to Tanner Bybee, who's getting more than double the ownership. So the ownership gap there makes Lopez a reasonable option. If, let's say, maybe you're full stacking Kansas City and you're taking on that KC ownership, maybe that's a lineup where you play Pablo Lopez instead of Tanner Bybee at the same price point because he is half the ownership. But I do think Bybee is in the better spot. He's the guy that, ownership aside, I would want to get to first. But Lopez is very talented and certainly capable of giving you a big game. Offensively, the Twins are probably the team that I would get to first. They offer some value. They don't have the very difficult matchup that Houston does. Brooks Lee also, 2K flat, gives you a value bet there. Former, I think, like 5th overall pick, 8th overall pick, I don't know, somewhere in there. I know he was rumored to be who the Orioles were going to take first overall when they took Jackson Holliday instead. Lee was called up the other day with Royce Lewis getting hurt. He projects not for a lot of power, like a 130-ish ISO. Doesn't have a ton of stolen base upside. So he's not my favorite guy that I'd be wanting to get to in tournaments because he's probably not hitting home run. He's probably not stealing a base. But, as part of a stack, or I should say I wouldn't like getting to him as a one-off in tournaments that much. As part of a stack, he's fine, saves you some ownership, correlates with the rest of your team. I haven't built a cash lineup. I don't know if he's necessary or not. But if you needed a 2K punt, like he's fine. He is a quality hitter overall, just doesn't do the things that you really need in DFS all that well. Buxton, if he's back in the lineup at 4,300, looks fine. Jeffers gives you power at catcher. Correa's gotten more expensive, but that was warranted. So I think Minnesota as a stack looks okay. They're not my favorite stack in this park, but they look okay. Yordan Alvarez from Houston, obviously a good play anytime you can get to him. Pablo Lopez, 174 expected ISO allowed to lefties this year. So he has given up some power, and Alvarez obviously is capable of doing damage against anybody. Overall, I don't love the offense. I don't really love anything from this game. I think it's sort of just Minnesota stacks are secondary stacks. Houston stacks are secondary stacks. Alvarez in particular would be the guy that I want to get to in tournaments from Houston. Pablo Lopez, a secondary pitching option. there's plenty that you can play from this game, but nothing that I'm expecting to be like a huge part of my night or that I'd be really excited about playing. Toronto going into one of the worst hitters parks in baseball in Seattle to face the Mariners, who are coming off of a win yesterday over the O's. Kevin Gausman, 8,300 for Toronto. Luis Castillo, 8,700 for the Mariners. Gausman getting some ownership at about 19%. Showed up as optimal 20% of the time for me. This is a pitcher that is not having as good a season this year as we have become accustomed to in recent seasons, but the salary has also dropped, and it's kind of just, at least for me, creating a vacuum where, yeah, I'm willing to acknowledge that he is not the same pitcher he has been in the past, but he's also not priced like that. 2023 or 2022 or 2021 Kevin Gausman in Seattle against the team with the highest strikeout percentage against right-handed pitching would be a 10K plus pitcher, not 8,300. So I think that he is still a good pitcher. He's just not a Cy Young contender like he has been in recent years. Still striking out 23% of hitters this year, 3.72 xFIP. Like, he's still fine. He's just not an ace, but he's not priced like one either. So I don't have any issues getting him in this spot, especially in this park as well. Home run issues are just mitigated here compared to pitching in Toronto. He's allowed 1.38 home runs per 9 this year, so that has been a problem for him. And this park just naturally corrects a lot of that. From a splits standpoint, Gausman has allowed a 225 expected ISO to lefties, 228 to righties. So he is giving up power to both sides of the plate. He actually has a higher strikeout percentage against righties this year. His splitter hasn't been as effective as in the past, which is one big reason that you see the drop off in his numbers. But all of that's a long way of saying, it's not like a slam dunk play like it would have been in previous years. If he were 8,300 last year in this spot, he'd be like 50+% owned. That's not the case tonight, but he does still look good. Castillo on the other side obviously benefits from this really, really good park as well. He is also a very good pitcher, striking out 23.8% of hitters this year, 3.85 xFIP. He is a solid contrarian pitcher in tournaments, getting 11% ownership. So not a ton of ownership on him here. Does give you upside. The problem is just that Toronto is a pretty difficult team to strike out. Only a 20.5% K percentage against right-handed pitching this year. It is a big park downgrade for them offensively, so that's nice for Castillo. One other thing that is really nice for him is that he has drastic splits as far as his strikeout numbers go. He has only struck out 18% of the left-handed hitters that he's faced this season, compared to 29.2% of right-handed hitters. Lefties have a 207 expected ISO and a 356 expected WOBA against him. Righties, only a 138 expected ISO and a 280 expected WOBA. Toronto doesn't really have left-handed hitters. Dalton Varsho is left-handed. He's an okay hitter, but the guys that you're mostly concerned with in this Toronto lineup, Bichette, if he's in there, Springer, Guerrero, all from the right side. It's a predominantly right-handed lineup. Danny Jansen's right-handed. Alejandro Kirk, if he's in the lineup, is right-handed. So while they are still difficult to strike out, Ernie Clement's right-handed. Schneider's right-handed. Like pretty much any lineup they roll out there is going to be righty-heavy. So while it is still a lineup that is talented and is difficult to strike out, Castillo has been much, much, much better at striking out right-handed hitters than left-handed hitters this year. So just looking at that overall 23.8% strikeout percentage is a little bit misleading when you consider the guys that Toronto is going to be putting in their lineup. Offensively, I don't have a ton of interest in either team because of this park. You have a slate that has a game in Coors Field. You have a game in Texas. You have a game in Cincinnati. You have a game in Yankee Stadium. You have Dodger Stadium. Going to Seattle is just such a difficult sell. Even though it is tempting to say, if 20% of the field is going to play Kevin Gausman, I like the upside that, Cal Raleigh gives me or Luke Raley gives me, whatever it may be from Seattle. That is true. It's just so much more difficult to hit home runs and score runs in general in this park compared to a lot of other parks on this slate. I do think that maybe mini stacking or grabbing one-offs here makes some sense. I've said it a lot, but Cal Raleigh is one of the best home run hitting catchers that we have. He has, more power than most catchers, and he's just never expensive because he does play his home games in this park. So Cal Raleigh is priced to play here. If he regularly played in a hitter-friendly park, he'd be, like a 5K catcher or something. So getting to somebody like Raleigh, I think makes a lot of sense. $3,200 Polanco could make some sense, like a two-man Polanco, Raleigh, and then you get to a Kansas City stack. Something like that makes a lot of sense to me. But overall, I think that going to this park against a still pretty good pitcher in Gausman as like a full stack or investing a lot into that, even though there is that upside there, is pretty tough sell just given the other good offensive environments on this slate. Orioles facing the A's in Oakland. Very, very good offense, very bad park for hitting. Albert Suarez going for the Orioles. Hogan Harris pitching for the A's. Neither pitcher getting much ownership. Suarez is getting more, and that makes sense. The A's obviously are not nearly as good a lineup as the Orioles are. Their active roster has the second highest strikeout percentage against right-handed pitching this year. Suarez is okay. He doesn't have any sort of pedigree. He most likely is going to end up being a multi-inning reliever for the O's. So far as a starter, 17.9% K percentage, 4.68 xFIP. He's, nothing to write home about. You're not going out of your way to get to him, but he is facing the A's. So if you get a little bit, that's fine. I will say though that I'm surprised he's projected for more ownership than Reese Olson at a cheaper price tag, than Drew Thorpe at a cheaper price tag. So that kind of goes back to my point from earlier. I think the ownership on those guys comes up, but if it doesn't, give me more of those guys at low ownership compared to Suarez. But it is a good park for pitching. It is a good strikeout matchup. Harris, I don't really have any interest in here. The O's are a really, really good offense. 6,300 is cheap, but you just have enough cheap pitching today that I don't think we really need to go up against Baltimore. The O's do look like a good stack despite this park because they are pretty inexpensive. Ryan Mountcastle, 4,300, going up against the lefty. Happy to get there. Austin Hayes, only 3,300. Gunnar obviously can hit anyone, gives you stolen base upside, gives you home run upside. Legitimate MVP candidate. He's another one where, I mentioned Bobby Witt being the best overall hitting play on the slate. You can only, on DraftKings, you can only play one of Witt, De La Cruz, Henderson. That means that the ownership to Henderson and to De La Cruz is just naturally going to be pretty low when they do give you the same offensive ceiling that Bobby Witt does, even though they don't project quite as well. One thing to pay attention to with the Orioles lineup, it goes back to what I was talking about with Kansas City. You are most likely going to get James McCann in the lineup tonight. He's not a good hitter overall, but he is 2,500 at catcher. If he is catching, which he normally is in this situation, if he is catching and Rutschman is DHing, there's not really pinch hit risk on McCann, and you can use him as a $2,500 punt if you need to. Say you're stacking the Orioles and you want to get the Gunner, but you can't afford Adley, then you can go to McCann. If Adley is catching, Adley had the day off yesterday, so if Adley is catching tonight and McCann's DHing, then you're probably getting McCann subbed out of this game as soon as a right-handed pitcher comes in. Again, it's more likely, I think, that McCann catches than Adley. That is generally what they do. That is a nuance to pay attention to in this lineup. Outside of that, though, Gunnar obviously not getting pinch hit for. Mountcastle probably not getting pinch hit for. Hayes potentially could. McCann, again, if he's DHing, pretty much will. Other than that, you don't have too much to worry about. Pay attention to Ryan O'Hearn. If he's not in the lineup to start, he probably will be in the lineup by the end of the game. He could pinch hit for Hayes. If McCann's DHing, he could pinch hit for McCann. And then pay attention to the outfield. You assume Santander is going to be in there. Cowser may or may not be in there. But when it comes to Hayes, you want to keep an eye on. They have so many lefties. There just is pinch hit risk basically anyway, because you have Kjerstad, you have Cowser, you have O'Hearn. Not all of those guys are going to be in the lineup. So I would say that Hayes has the most pinch hit risk. McCann, if he's DHing, has the most, but assuming McCann's catching, I think Hayes has the most pinch hit risk. They're probably not pinch hitting for Mountcastle. He's a good hitter against anybody. You could, if it's like a really high leverage situation late in the game, get Kjerstad or O'Hearn in for him, but Hayes would be the guy that I'm most concerned about here from a pinch hit standpoint, assuming that McCann is a catcher. Oakland is kind of interesting against Suarez just because he's not a very, he's not a great pitcher, and the O's bullpen right now is banged up. They are struggling a little bit. Langoliers has a lot of power at catcher. He's cheap. Lede has some upside. Rooker's pretty expensive, but has upside. I don't think Oakland's a priority like Baltimore is, but I do think they kind of fit into that Seattle category where using like a two-man of Langoliers and Lede or Langoliers and Rooker or something like that with a high upside, high probability main stack like Baltimore or like Kansas City, that would make some sense to me. Arizona going into Petco to face San Diego. Decent spot for offenses here. Randy Vasquez taking on Slade Ciccone. Neither of these pitchers are very good. Neither one's getting ownership. Neither one really should. It is worth a mention that Vasquez is still $5,200 on DraftKings. He's not a good pitcher. He is better than $5,200. It's not a good matchup. I don't think we need to go there. I don't think we need to go to Ciccone in a brutal matchup against San Diego, but just felt the need to mention that he is $5,200. Offensively, I do have some interest here. Corbin Carroll projected for about 10% ownership at $4,800. I like that. He gives you stolen base upside. Vasquez has only struck out 8% of the left-handed hitters that he has faced this season. 234 expected ISO, 484 expected WOBA allowed. Small sample size and all of that. It's a really good spot for Corbin Carroll. Good spot for Ketel Marte. I like him as a second base option. Christian Walker obviously just destroyed Dodger Stadium all weekend long. He will be hitting, as always, from the right side, so he doesn't have that platoon advantage against Vasquez, but he's still a good hitter facing a pitcher who isn't very good. Jack Peterson, 4,700. Some pinch hit risk for him potentially, but good spot overall against Vasquez. Diamondbacks look like a pretty good secondary stack. Again, I don't think they're on that same level with like Kansas City or Detroit, but they're in that next tier for me, at least in my head of where I would put them, where I would like to get to them. And then San Diego, again, without Tatis, it's not as dangerous a lineup, but it is still a pretty good lineup overall. Ciccone so far this season, 162 expected ISO allowed to lefties, 235 to righties. If you go back to the start of last season, those reverse splits have carried over. 237 expected ISO since debuting with the Diamondbacks last year to righties, 181 to lefties. Does have a higher strikeout percentage against righties. Overall, I think you kind of, if you're going to the Padres, just play the best hitters you can. Manny Machado, 5,200 looks fine. The price tag on Jackson Merrill at 4,200 looks pretty good. Those would be the first two guys I think that I get to from the Padres. You get some value elsewhere. Somebody like Donovan Solano, I don't love as a one-off in tournaments, but if you're stacking the Padres, he positively correlates with the guys that I actually want to get to, and he's cheap, so that makes some sense. But individually, Machado and Merrill, I think, make the most sense to me. And then we get yet another good hitters park with the Dodgers taking on the Brewers in LA. So Milwaukee going from Coors Field to LA. Tyler Glasnow is pitching for the Dodgers, so very difficult hitting matchup for the Brewers. No idea who's pitching for Milwaukee. Nobody showed up in anything I ran. Nobody is listed right now on DraftKings, so I guess we're just gonna have to wait and see on that one. If that's been announced in the last hour or so and somebody saw it, let me know. Oh, that's what it is. Okay. Stephen Leibowitz said Savali against the Dodgers. Yeah, I forgot that he had showed up earlier. So yeah, Savali, but I assume not going to get DraftKings points. I don't know. I guess they'll update that later because they do have him listed, I think, for Tampa Bay. Let me see. Yeah, they have him listed still for Tampa Bay. So I don't know what they'll do about that. Either way, I don't think you're probably looking to get to Savali on this slate against the Dodgers. He is really, really cheap. He's 5,600. So, if they move him to Milwaukee and they say you can play him and you absolutely need to punt, I guess I would rather play Savali probably than Randy Vasquez at sub 6K. But I don't think you're going to need to actually get there. It sets up a pretty decent spot for the Dodgers. Savali isn't a horrible pitcher, but nothing special either. The Dodgers, obviously a very, very high upside offense, especially if you can afford the top of the lineup. Lefties this year, 183 expected ISO against Savali. Righties only 135. Shohei Ohtani looks very, very good as always. Freddie Freeman, if you can afford him, looks good. Those are the guys I'd want to get to the most. The problem with the Dodgers that you always run into, and it's no different today, is that the guys that you really want, Ohtani, Freeman, Smith, to some extent Hernandez, they're all really expensive. So they're difficult to stack together. And then the guys that allow you to afford them, Miguel Rojas, Kevin Biggio, Gavin Lux, they suck. So for the most part. So it does create a situation where it's not the most appealing stack to get to. I will point out Miguel Vargas at 3,200, if he happens to actually be in the lineup, is a pretty good value that you can use to offset those other guys. But, I think it's a team that I probably get to more as one-offs and mini stacks. Grab Shohei Ohtani, grab Vargas, throw him, as a two-man in with another primary stack. But if you can find a way to get to that actual good part of the Dodgers, obviously they look good. On the other side for Milwaukee, not really looking to go up against Glasnow. The one thing to keep in mind with him is that he does suck at holding runners. So there is stolen base upside for Milwaukee. If these guys get on base, they're going to run anybody with any semblance of speed. The problem is just it's a 12-game slate, so I don't think that is super actionable. It is something to keep in mind for the late slate. I didn't look yet to see how many games it is. I assume it's 4. Yeah, 4. So the 4-game late slate, I would keep that in mind. Milwaukee obviously has a low implied run total. They're not going to be a really fun team to get to. Glasnow, I'm sure on that slate is going to have a ton of ownership, but they do give you upside even if they don't hit home runs. If they can just get on base against Glasnow, there is stolen base upside. So I think that's more of a late slate thing than main slate probably. Glasnow, forgot to mention it, but does look like one of the best pitching plays on the slate. He is looking like he's going to go a little bit over-owned, but still one of the higher probability guys. He's showing up as optimal 17% of the time for me, even at $10,800. Ownership's at 31%. So maybe in larger field tournaments, I prioritize some expensive bats a little bit more and go with, that like 7 to 9K range of pitchers that I think is solid enough. But if you can find the money for Glasnow, obviously he's a good play as always. So that's 12 games. That's all I have from a game by game standpoint. To recap everything, pitching, Glasnow, Reagans, Bybee, Gossman, I think your Cortez, I think kind of your top set of guys. I kind of expect that I live in that like Reagans, Gossman, Cortez range a lot and get to some really good bats. But if I can afford Glasnow, happy to do it. He's obviously really, really good. Bybee, looks good as well. But then there's also this range of like contrarian pivots to these guys. And it's why I think that you see the pitchers getting the most ownership coming in under owned for me. I think Tanner Bybee is a better play than Aaron Nola or Luis Castillo or Max Fried or Pablo Lopez, but I don't think it's by like a really big margin. And he's basically like 2-1 in ownership against those guys. So in your larger field tournaments, if in lineups where you are playing popular stacks, I think going to any of this group makes a lot of sense. And then Reese Olson, from a value standpoint, I think the ownership projection on him comes up, but I do think he's a good value even in that park. Good pitcher, does a good job limiting power, and can get some strikeouts against Cincinnati. So that's all I have for you today. Don't forget to hit the thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, all that stuff, and I will see you back here on Monday.